today I want to talk about my latest obsession, who is Catherine Carswell, and her first novel, Open the Door. But first I need to give you a little bit of background to my thesis to explain something of what I mean when I use the term revelatory experience, which is something I'm going to be using a lot. I'm conducting a literary analysis of a range of both fiction and non-fiction texts from the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries. I'm looking at everything from highbrow canonical fiction through to popular fiction and working class memoir. But all have this common thread in that they feature descriptions of extraordinary moments that punctuate the everyday. Moments where the character or author is temporarily transported and transformed. This could be in a range of ways. It could be by a beautiful landscape. It could equally be by some spiritual encounter or realisation. Or the transcendence could be derived from an intellectual or vocational endeavour, tying into with what Gemma's just been discussing actually, where you're momentarily transformed in terms of your perception of yourself and of the world and of yourself within the world. But what interests me most keenly is the ephemeral and unsustainable nature of these moments. I'm not looking at moments that affect a radical and irrevocable change. I'm looking at moments of everyday wonder and their accompanying anxieties and worries. It's this sort of continual resting between the sublime and the banal that has fascinated me and has formed the core of my thesis. It's transcendence interrupted, if you will. So much of the writing that I've looked at inhabits an area of poise where the subjects of the revelatory experiences are suspended in this realm of uncertainty and of questioning, where revelation doesn't necessarily lead to resolution. A fast-paced 19th century had gifted a multitude of possibility, but an equal supply of accompanying constraints, producing this sort of stagnation that was ironically born of this increased choice. So that's the inertia of my title. So, how does Catherine Carswell fit into all of this? Except I've just blanked the screen. That's the right way? No? Sorry. Technical hitch. There we go. I need to use the arrow keys, don't I? That's the key. So, Catherine Carswell, in her first novel, Open the Door, she gives us a wonderfully complex narrative, a sort of fiction in transition. As my supervisor, Glenda Norkey, has pointed out in her work on the author, this text may have been published in 1920, but it was 5 years in the writing, and it remains, and I quote Glenda here, very much a book of the pre-war era, marking in itself a transition from 19th century realism to the more fragmented, experimental and introspective style characteristic of early 20th century fiction, and reworking the romance narrative. As such, this text embodies the central conceit of my thesis, occupying precisely the sort of transitional position athwart two distinct states that I have described. It's neither prepared to revert entirely to the previous state, nor to resolve wholly to the next, and as such I've become utterly fixated with it. So, the term New Woman was coined by the writer and public speaker Sarah Grant in the mid-1890s, and was subsequently adopted to explain a new breed of woman, emancipated, educated and self-sufficient. Carswell's protagonist in Open the Door, Joanna Bannerman, is for me a new woman with an unusually old-fashioned soul. She's a middle-class dreamer and intellectual, studying at the Glasgow School of Art. If I can flip this over. Joanna is described as being filled with, and I quote from the text, painful yet exquisite longing, yet she did not know what ailed her, nor what she desired. The ambiguity of feeling is common in the text that I'm analysing. The notion that one might be anything leads to paralysis and stagnation, as the right path shows itself only in fleeting glimpses and fragments. While it's enough to pique the interest, it's not necessarily solid enough to grasp. So, another key feature of my revelatory moments is what I would call a continued romance with a small r, with the romantic with a big R. The texts that I'm looking at imbue their descriptions of such experiences with images that are evocative of the great romantic poets, who themselves were disposed to hark back to idealised and imagined golden ages that were at least long past, if indeed they ever existed at all. I'm finding it interesting to look at the effect of bringing the Romantic age forward in time, to sit somewhat incongruously in a more modern and perhaps even more cynical age. And we've certainly got an element of this in Open the Door. Carswell's description of Joanna's early years details her intense and long-lasting relationship with nature. A particular report of the young Joanna communing with the landscape at the family holiday home at Duntarvie, is almost Wordsworthian in tone. I'd like to look at this particular passage in detail. Joanna's early morning visit to the nearby ponds is framed in folklore, adding a dash of magic to the imagined memory. And so we have the upper pond was a mysterious water. It was fed by a natural spring, and a legend of the neighbourhood told of a golden cradle in its depths containing the body of a king's babe immune to mortal decay. Can I just grab a glass of water? Sorry, I've had a bit of a croaky throat. And I think it's going to fail me. Okay. So, we just move on to the next section. Yeah, on this particular visit to the pond, Joanna immerses herself in the water, where she lies perfectly still, letting the wildlife around her in this haunted pool go about its business undisturbed by her presence. At that moment, the 12-year-old child entered deeply into nature's heart, and for the first time it came to her that she might make of her rapture a place of retreat for future days. It was a discovery. Henceforth she felt nothing. No one would have the power to harm her. For all her life now she would have this hidden refuge. Even if she were burned at the stake or flayed alive, she would be able to fly in spirit from her torturers to this reedy water, and they would wonder why she smiled amid the flames. And so she lay on until she was bodiless, and only the cold penetrating through her clothes to her skin reminded her, and her stirring startled the heron. And stretching herself and shaking the water from her hair, Joanna felt glad at the thought of breakfast. Now, there are a number of things going on in this passage. First, we have the framing of the narrative. It's presented like a fairy tale. And it's indicating this idealised image of the Golden Age. And then there is the moment of the discovery, Joanna's secret mini-epiphany, as she realises that she can keep this perfect moment of tranquility and awe and carry it with her. Then there is the accompanying thoughts of her return to earth, as the cold water sleeping from her clothing rouses her, and she returns her thoughts back to the house, and to breakfast, and to the waking world that awaits her. In her consideration of the novel, Carol Anderson makes a useful parallel with a group of artists known as the Four. These comprise Charles Rennie Mackintosh, Herbert McNair, and the MacDonald sisters Margaret and Frances. Having honed their craft like Carswell at the Glasgow School of Art, these artists also spent time here in Liverpool in the 1890s. In fact, the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine has got, where I work, has got one of their pictures, but I wasn't able to hunt it out in time to find it for the presentation today. But in 2007, the Walker Gallery exhibited a number of their works, highlighting the fixation of 19th century Britain with Arthurian legend and chivalry. The watercolours of Margaret and Frances MacDonald particularly use these images of knight, chivalry and courage as an imaginative antidote to the harsher realities of urban industrialisation. In two pictures in particular, firstly entitled Girl with Blue Butterflies and the other simply Girl with Butterflies, which we'll come to in a moment. And I want to look at these two paintings in relation to this passage in the pond. The first is recognisably pre-Raphaelite in style, evoking the grand style of the mid-19th century. It's opulent and idealised. This was painted by Frances in 1898 and echoes the image of Joanna Bannerman suspended in her watery wonderland really quite well. The next is a later version of the same piece, this time painted in the 1900s. There is a perceptible shift in style and the Walker capture it perfectly here in their online exhibition catalogue, where they state that the romantic heroine of the 1890s has been replaced by a delicate and inscrutable creature who inhabits an incorporeal world. This description, a delicate and inscrutable creature inhabiting an incorporeal world, at first seemed to me a perfect description for Carswell's heroine, but I don't accept it entirely. I think there is more going on with the character of Joanna, which I will come to in a moment. Her continual retreat into states of daydream and half-waking is intensely wrought in the strong visual imagery deployed within the text. Carol Anderson points out that the many and varied descriptions of land and cityscapes in the novel frequently feature silvery colours, dark hues and soft pearly shades of twilight. We are told early in the novel that Joanna led almost wholly a dream life, and that in two respects only was the child's being vivid, in the activity of her body and in her dreams. I will return to Joanna in physical activity shortly, but I want to look at an interesting complication in this idea of Joanna as dedicated dreamer. To reference Glenda once more, Joanna is, it is important to note, suspicious of false dreams, which are described again in folkloric terminology as will-o'-the-wisps which could lead the spirit disastrously astray. And so we learn that she is a discerning dreamer, and one who, and I quote, was of that sort whose imaginings are never without some touch of the practical and the material. This tension is highlighted in a scene where she attends a ball and dances a Scottish reel wholeheartedly. As the reel progressed, she began to lose all sense of identity. Every moment she became less herself, more a mere rhythmical expression from the soil from which she had sprung. The memory dawned in her of some far back ancestress, fresh, dim and sweet like dawn, and soon she was no more than a field of barley that swings unseen in the wind. However, a touch of the practical and material is about to impinge on this scene, as a key witness to her dancing is one Lewis Pender, a figure with whom Joanna engages in a lengthy extramarital affair. His worldliness and to some degree his cynicism pervades the scene, and when she becomes aware of his gaze, she's recalled to herself and is no longer the field of barley. And so we can see this resting back and forth between binary oppositions, the dream and the material, the false and the true, and all of which combine to act upon the protagonist of the text and to hold her fast. Joanna wants to engage with the modern, with the changing world that excites and stimulates her, but it is insubstantial and disappointing, and she finds she ultimately can't invest in it. Pender is meant to signify the allure of modern society, but is ultimately flawed and fettered. Carol Anderson calls him a society man with small-scale ambitions. He is a fragment, a half-life. At one point in the text, he is referred to as a man that's dead as dead. Similarly, Joanna's brother has a circle of great Gatsby-esque friends who make fun of him. Upon seeing her brother happily assume the role of underdog and clown, Joanna's pride is stung and she distances herself from it. She's disappointed once more by shallow modernity. The Bannerman family also have a well-to-do aunt and cousins, and they sneer at her lack of refinement. The contrast between this joyless peripheral aunt and the ugly stepsister cousins, who lack the Bannerman's natural charm, is fairy tale stuff, pulling us again away from the modern into something warm and familiar. We know how this story is meant to play out, and we are meant to cheer for Joanna, and yet Carswell never lets you relax into this. There are other conflicting undercurrents in the text, and the character of Joanna is complex and frustrating, and she's not always easy to like, as this next section will show. Despite her inherent understanding of what is false and meaningless, Joanna's dual nature cannot help flirting with her inner actress. She makes a conscious effort, particularly through her clothing, to exude this air of sophistication, and she's aware of the power afforded to her by outward appearances. When her exasperation with the unknowable Lewis Pender reaches a tipping point, she calculatedly becomes temporarily engaged to faithful and straightforward admirer Lawrence Urquhart. This move is designed to elicit a reaction from Pender, and the description of her anticipation of his receiving the news is revealing. She was poised and keen like a hawk in mid-air, a speck of perfect bliss upheld in perfection of readiness for the predatory swoop. Yet in that same instant, she also lived by with every pulse for that every other consummation in which her breast would be transfixed by talons sharper than her own. And therein, shining in this moment of dual revelation, her new knowledge lay clear. Joanna's discovery was that evil, in the Christian sense of the word, quite as much as good, had made her alive. That evil, quite as much as good, had made her an individual, a human being, a divine creation herself capable of creative life. To her, it was a vision, no less. She knew she would never quite be the same after it as she had been before. And this is the passage that links directly to my title. For here, what we have is a grand realisation with no external impact whatsoever. Joanna realises that she is both good and bad, and that to be herself she cannot deny either aspect of her nature. But where does this really leave her? Her lover Lewis Pender is as elusive as ever. He must either accept that fact and continue in this state of limbo, or she must reject it and escape to Lawrence Urquhart as she threatens to do. In the end, she does neither. She breaks off the engagement and would-be escape, resuming her relationship with Pender, while secretly resenting that she can never make it a grand love affair. But this is a restless novel that actively pursues situations that are static and cyclical. While Joanna travels quite a lot, her real restlessness is internal. She resides in Italy and London throughout the text, but it is Scotland with all of its accompanying baggage, including a complicated maternal relationship and the shackles of societal and religious constraints that in the end seem to make Joanna feel most free. Glenda Norkey pointed out, and I quote, that one of the novel's underlying concerns is with role and vocation. Joanna's mother, in many ways, embodies the last of a breed of Victorian women who found an outlet for their energies in religion and philanthropy. Lacking her mother's faith, such an avenue is not open to Joanna, but she nevertheless seeks a purpose in the world. Interestingly, Joanna Bannerman is at her happiest when some physical labour is undertaken. Whether she's sewing a suit of clothes for her brother late into the night, or packing up the house for her ailing mother. These are things that allow her to sleep soundly and unworried. She crafts the fashion designs that earn her living in the early morning hours so as not to fall behind when family duties beckon. And while this tires her physically, she often seems well mentally when this outlet is at her disposal. This lends a balance to the novel, so it never seems indulgent or introspective. This again is a common theme for many of the subjects I've been looking at. Snatched hours at dawn or dusk devoted to creativity or learning equip them with enough mental sustenance to cope with the more difficult aspects of life. As such, the major disturbance needed to effect a change never comes, instead replaced by small, barely perceptible incremental changes and small realisations. Book 3 of the novel declares boldly, "Behold, I make all things new," and interestingly, this is taken from the Book of Revelation. I wondered how true this claim is, and it led me to question my notions of inertia and stagnation that I had when I wrote the title of this paper. On page 211 of the text, we are told that Joanna was not happy, but neither was she unhappy. She was again undergoing a change, a divestment, of which the meaning would not become clear for her until the process was completed. Swaddled from before birth in religious emotionalism, in romance and spiritual exaltation, it was natural that she should cling to these suffocating wrappings. Should cling, that is, with the conscious mental part of her, so that as far as she was conscious, she was false. It had to be so. I think this passage is key to unlocking the strangeness of this novel, and its curious stance athwart both realist and modernist styles. The novel is a contradiction, the meaning of which will not become clear until the process is completed. And so to the ending of the novel, where Joanna is reunited with both Dunt Harvey and the steadfast Scottish folklorist Lawrence Urquhart. Many critics find this ending too tidy for modern writing, and the decision to have the heroine find romantic rather than artistic fulfilment is regarded as an unsatisfactory choice. But it's important to remember that this is not necessarily a modern novel. There are issues to resolve and vestiges of the past to be assimilated before the door to the future can truly open. In fact, it might even be said to have been a radical move to promote romance over artistic integrity, at a time when it was not in the least bit fashionable to do so. I myself am not clear, and I feel that the oscillatory nature of my feelings towards this text have much in common with the confused inertia of my title. But I'm going to read more Catherine Carswell, and for now I am convinced that in the context of its time and place, Open the Door is a bold and visionary novel, brimming with optimism and possibility. And I'm sorry I've run terribly on.